Good afternoon. My name is Alon Confino. I'm a historian of Europe, Germany, the Holocaust, the 1948 war here. And I welcome you to our roundtable discussion to study and teach the Holocaust and genocide in the context of conflict and trauma. This is the penultimate session of the fifth conference of the International Association of Genocide Researchers. The INO conference that is coming to a conclusion today is a great achievement for the academia in Israel in the study of the Holocaust and genocide in Israel. Some 200 researchers from all around the globe have given presentations during the course of 4 days, 60 lectures on diverse topics related to the history and the memory of the Holocaust and other cases of genocide around the world. I would like to first of all thank the organizers of the conference, Professor Danny Blattman, Dr. Amos Goldberg, and Dr. Raz Segal for the amazing work that they have done, and also thank them for asking me to organize this particular session, and to thank Yuchi Fisher as well and the Van Leer Institute, in whose venue we are currently convening. We thought that we should adjourn the conference with a special session that goes beyond academic lectures, that addresses the public at large, Palestinians and Jews in Israel, and the many participants from abroad whose focus is the attempt to try between the academic aspects of the conference, Holocaust and genocide, and the life of the people living in this country. Past stories the Jews and Palestinians tell themselves in the context of the present time and their life of ongoing violence, how they tell others about the Holocaust and other cases of genocide and their traumatic past. Our focus is not the discussion of the Holocaust and other cases of genocide as they took place in the past, but rather how Jews and Palestinians remember the past, visualize the past, and represent the past. I now remember what I neglected to tell you. I wanted to remind you that when the conference ends, don't forget to turn on your cell phones, okay? No, that's just a tip, you know, just a friendly tip. So we're going to talk about memory and the way people see things, the way people perceive things today, more or less today, I mean. We won't talk about the Holocaust and other cases of genocide as they took place in the past. No. We will talk about that too, perhaps, but for the time being, the session has a life of its own that changed its, character and meaning somewhat. First of all, the session and its participated were criticized for being Holocaust deniers, and I take this very seriously. Some of the participants, the Jewish participants, were subject to pressure because of their participation. In and of itself, this criticism did not change the essence of this session. It was a discourse between Jews about different interpretations of the memory of the Holocaust. But when Antoine Sholchat announced that he could not attend the session because people whom he respects told him that his participation would damage the BDS activity, Antoine, a journalist, an editor, a critic, and a translator living in Akko, namely an Israeli Palestinian, published a few books, mostly about the Palestinian literature in Israel. Among his translations from the Hebrew literature to the Arabic language is The Road to El Harod by Amos Keinan, The Conflict by Katzetnik, and Ghetto by Yoshua Sobol. He is a co-researcher in the Palestinian Center for the Study of Israel that was founded in 2000 in Ramallah. And it's nothing trivial that the translator of Katzetnik and Sobol into Arabic decides that his place is not amongst us. One cannot actually shirk this off as being nothing. This refusal of his as if it's just an example of some sort of extremism. I'm so curious to know who's calling you. So you cannot exempt or say that his refusal is his own personal problem, or as an example of extremism. It's also the problem of Jews, and it's not necessarily extreme. And you look at things from his point of view. It requires some attention and thought. Silence has power. Without the Palestinian voice, this session changed its nature altogether. What is the meaning of this session now when we only have 4 Jews sitting in it without any Palestinian voice? The original attempt was to place together Jews and Palestinians together so that they can have a dialogue and try to understand the historic memory of the other. And that is done as the only Israeli discussion, the only one held in Hebrew. And this is why we thought we will have Arabs and Jews participating in it. But all that is not happening when Jews only converse among themselves. Session without Palestinian contradicts the two ideas of the conference. Actually lifting the Jewish history from narrow particularism to a bridge between the Jewish history and the universal history. So in a session that discusses groups that suffer from state violence and breach and violation of human rights without a Palestinian voice, something is utterly missing here. We considered canceling the session, but we decided that it does have a value nonetheless, because the difficulty discussing these topics are an important part of the very essence of those topics. This session simply was given another meaning, and it represents to what extent the discourse between memory and history, between Jews who think differently and Jews and Arabs who think differently, is difficult and maybe even impossible. The space and the scope of conversation became extremely narrow. What we have is two things that are not exactly identical. On the one hand, we have some space, a very narrow space for discourse, because Jews accuse the organizers of the panel of denying the Holocaust on the one hand, and the BDS that refuses to have any connection between Jews and Arabs on the other. So these two groups have one aim, and that is to prevent Jews and Arabs from talking, each for its own reasons. And that is the result. Another point is why the refusal of Anton to participate, which is more complex, and I will perhaps address that too among the other topics that I will relate to. The question is not only what are we to say about those past stories, but how to talk about those stories. So my aim in this introductory part is to raise a few points for discussion and thought on how to study the Holocaust and genocide in the in the context of conflict and trauma, and the difficulty discussing it. What I say represents myself and not necessarily other participants in the panel. Every one of us has different opinions, and this is the reason why we invited 4 speakers. The audience is comprised of 2 groups. One group is people, the rank and file who came to listen, and another one is comprised of the researchers of the conference. I just wanted to mention this point. The tone is reflexive. It's not declarative. We're not setting anything that would be etched in stone. It's not that we don't have answers. There are answers. But perhaps it's more important to raise questions and doubts. Only through these can we look at ourselves and the other. And because at the very center of our discussion lies the historic memory of Jews and Palestinians, what results from it is that we are dealing with extremely, extremely sensitive topics. Some of the opinions that would be voiced here from every direction and every interpretation would be tough for some of the people sitting in the audience. To listen and to try to understand does not necessarily mean to agree, but it does mean that we must be fully attentive and patient. You can say whatever you want, but in a very moderate tone, without getting too heated up about it. So I will not tolerate any interjections, or the only one giving the floor here is me. Only me. This is enlightened absolutism. I'm not in favor of democracy. We don't have any democracy here, not at all. You can pick between the tyrant of North Korea, Putin, Trump, whatever, but it's up to you. So let's start from the beginning. from the original idea that lies behind this session, that still lies at its very center. Our topic here is the stories of the past that we relate to ourselves. The sense of the personal and collective identity requires a story of the past. And even if we decide to suppress it, to embellish it, to beautify it, or to simply lie to ourselves about it, the story of the past that we tell ourselves is always time-dependent, location-dependent, and it has to have a social, political, and cultural context. It's true for historians too. Their goal is to accurately represent the past. Evidence and methodologies are the raw materials of their art. Their attempt is to tell true story, but the foundation for every historic work is to truly and honestly represent the past. But at the same time, historians are also the product of the society and the culture they live in, with its values, its beliefs, and its prejudice. And it's definitely true about the historic memory of societies, about those stories of the past that, unlike the profession of history, are not restricted by evidence and the intention to truthfully represent the past. The whole idea of structuring a historic memory, both in the popular culture and the researchers, is a part of being a society. Inter alia, because of this intensive occupation with the Holocaust, the central question in the study of memory: who wants whom to remember what and why? Memories change with time, but they always represent our identities at present. The memories of our past do not reflect what happened in the past, but rather what we would want to see happening in the past. They do not represent a historic truth, but rather an imagination, fantasy, an identity. This does not mean that our historic memory is not rife with facts that did take place. Of course it is. But memory does not bear the commitment to represent the past truthfully and honestly. Quite the contrary. We remember the past not in order to study its nature, but in order to distort it, so that we can build our identity in the present time that is a lot more convenient to us, so as to forget very inconvenient past that we don't want to remember, to imbue our life with meaning and justify them, especially in those cases in which we operate in an immoral way. The key political context that represents our life and our identity here in Israel, when I say life and identity, I mean Israeli citizens, Jews and Palestinians alike, is the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Whether these are debates about the meaning of 1948, whether it's the reality of the occupation at present. I think that it's very hard to disagree with that. And because of this reason, the context of conflict and trauma that appears in the title of this session is the one that really shapes, inter alia, the way by which we remember, study, and even research and argue over the Holocaust and other cases of genocide. And from here comes the point of departure for this session. It is very clear, but it's important. In Denmark and in China, people remember the Holocaust differently to the way Jews and Palestinians remember it here. And the idea is to study about the Holocaust and genocide in the political context of the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians, and not as if the genocide takes place between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The idea is not to deny the Holocaust, as some argue. I take this argument very seriously, because the Holocaust is a traumatic, formative experience in the Israeli society. I can understand the fear of what seems as the dilution, as if we dilute the historic element of the Holocaust. I don't think the participants of the session attempt to deny the Holocaust. All the participants were very active in commemorating the Holocaust and studying it for many years in their career. The way I see this, at least as far as I'm concerned, is that I'm a researcher of the Holocaust and its memory, with every aspect of it, political and historic. To understand the memory of the Holocaust from a historic context is not to deny it. And understanding it in a comparative context does not mean anti-Semitism or anti-Zionist, as some argued not too long ago. I perceive memory in a way that is not substantial existentialist, namely it changes, it always bears political meaning, it has more than one meaning. Historians and other researchers showed that nobody has any copyright over any memory, including the memory of the Holocaust. How to use it and for what purpose? What different purposes do you use it for? From supporting human rights and supporting vegetarianism. The memory of the Holocaust was used for various purposes. Those who criticize want a unique memory of the Holocaust, a pure one with one political meaning, and it is theirs. And mostly it means to actually give legitimacy to the occupation of the territories and to deny the rights of the Palestinians in the name of the Jewish sacrifice. But you have to study this and to see where this comes from. Some of the questions that we can ask, therefore, are how come denying human rights and the right of self-determination of the Palestinians in the occupied territories impact the way Jews think about the Holocaust, the way they visualize it and commemorate it, if at all. Maybe it doesn't have any influence. How historians tell the story of the past of a genocide in a state of ongoing violence, perpetual violence. This violent present, does it have any impact about the story of the past that historians and others are telling? If the historians has special responsibility, and if he does have special responsibility, what is it? There's a big gap that is widening between contemporary trends in the study of the Holocaust and genocide around the world, and among some of the researchers in Israel that understand the Holocaust in a comparative, contrastive way as part of the phenomenon of genocide as a whole. I made a mistake here. I'll reread this. There's a big gap that is widening between contemporary trends in the study of Holocaust and genocide. It only means that I'm fully aware of what I'm reading. I'm not just reciting this to you. So there's a growing gap between contemporary trends in the study of the Holocaust and genocide in the world on the one hand, and the Israeli memory among a group of scholars in Israel that see the Holocaust a unique singular event on the other. So this popular insistence in Israel on the singularity of the Holocaust that most of the researchers of Holocaust and genocide, including Professor Yehuda Bauer, was one of the formulators of the singularity theory, and he retracted from it. Is it related to the situation of the conflict and the negation of the rights of Palestinians? When I wrote these brief comments, I thought, what would the memory of the Holocaust look like without the occupation and the negation of human rights in the occupied territories? Some of the ways that we remember the Holocaust with are transnational. These are things that happened here, that happened in Europe, in Germany, in North America, in Europe, and the Israeli society is a part of a whole larger complex of the memory of the Holocaust, starting from the 1950s to this very day. No wonder that in the 1980s, therefore, important representations of the Holocaust came into being, whether it's in Israeli literature, the international film industry, etc. So every country, though, has its own particular, memory of the Holocaust. That's very clear. If things were different, we would have remembered it differently, and maybe we would have used it differently politically. So these are a few of the questions that we would like to consider. What does it mean that a Palestinian citizen of the State of Israel refusal to participate in a session such as this? Is this a proof to the fact that Palestinians don't want to have any dialogue? Perhaps the meaning is more complex than what meets the eye. We must see this from his perspective. Just like we would like, to have those people who think that we deny the Holocaust to see it from the way our perspective. Jews have to place themselves in the place of the minority, even though it's so hard to visualize what this minority is going through. The power relations are definitely not equal. A Palestinian citizen of Israel comes to us to talk about the matzav, the situation. We hardly go there. Jews hardly ever go to the Palestinians to talk about that very same situation. We hardly ever visit Arab localities. The language is always Hebrew. It's never Arabic. We behave very freely, and there's no need to constantly be self-conscious. A behavior that is reserved to the members of the majority. But the Palestinians have to weigh their words and their conduct. They have to behave. They have to recognize our traumatic past, the Holocaust. But his traumatic past, the Nakba, causes discomfort and even objection and violence. And there's the political inequality and the economic inequality and the occupation, of course, beyond Israeli borders. I do not justify his decision not to come. Not at all. Not at all. That's clear. But I am attempting to understand the motives. The meaning of discussion that is take place only among Jews is decisive. Without the voice of the other, the Palestinian, the voice of the Jews is silenced and becomes meaningless, even if the intentions are good, and there are good intentions. Only the other can challenge us to think outside of ourselves, to understand to what extent we are protected by the narrative of our history and our memory because we are members of the majority group. Sometimes it is the good intentions that make us feel that the story that we're telling is enough, is sufficient, that we don't need this other voice, the voice of the Palestinian. But the Palestinian story is not something that is superfluous to that of the Jewish one. One does not have any meaning without the other, for both sides. So there's a big question mark concerning what stories the Jews will tell us today, including my own. Don't believe the stories that we're about to tell you today, not because they're not true, but because most probably something very fundamental will be missing there. It is that voice, that smell, that richness, the suffering of the Palestinian natives of this land. We can think about things in the following way. I'm not saying that necessarily that's the way they took place, but we can think about them that way. In a context of violence and trauma, not everyone was made equal. There's no symmetry between history and the modern fate of the Jew in Israel and the history and the fate of the Palestinians in Palestine. There is a people that established its homeland, resulting from this, it caused another people to lose its homeland. There's an occupier and an occupied. There is the sovereign and the subjects. You can understand this interpretation if you separate between intentions and results. The Jews judge Zionism according to their intentions. They're good intentions, so they argue. The intentions of the Jews very often were good, not necessarily evil, but Arabs judge Zionism by its result, the catastrophic results for the natives of this land. The intentions are extremely important, but also the results. So are the results. And these today comprise the fabric of life, which is that of violence and trauma that we are forced to live in. This is what we've convened for, right? This is what we wanted to give some thought to. And one has to think about the traumatic formative pasts of the two peoples, each people with their own past. For the Jews, obviously, this past is the Holocaust. For the Palestinians, it is the Nakba. Perhaps there's no deeper taboo in the Israeli society than actually including them both in one sentence. That comprises a political danger, or even a moral danger. And perhaps it is so. But the memory joins historic events into one story, not in order to compare between them or to actually try to find the reason and the effect. It's not a historic methodology, this memory. Memory connects between events being based on similarities, imagination, fears, concerns, feelings, and also trauma, our private memory and also our national memory. When we discuss traumatic pasts among Jews or Palestinians, these are the pasts. There aren't any others. We must take this very seriously because Jews and Palestinians take them very seriously. Is it possible to talk about them as traumatic past in a way that would make us reach certain insights? And if so, how? Three renowned researchers would talk about these topics with us today. Sidra Dekon-Izrahi, Professor Emerita in Comparative Literature at the Hebrew University. Her book, The Holocaust Literature by Rhodes Alone, that was published in 1980. Was one of the first books in which the topic was studied. She later participated in symposia that developed in the last few decades about the shaping of the Holocaust in literature, in history, and theory, and philosophical theory. Dan Michman, Professor Emeritus of Modern Jewish History, heading the Finkler Institute for the Study of Holocaust at the Bar-Ilan University. Of the prominent researchers of the Holocaust in our contemporary times, he serves as the head of the International Institution for the Study of Holocaust and the head of the John Nyman Chair at the Yad Vashem Institute. And ultimately, Yehudit Kol-Inbar has served for many years as the head of the museum department in Yad Vashem, role in which she served until recently. She was the curator of the new complex of museums and was also the senior curator in the steering committee for the project of renewing the Jewish cabin in Auschwitz that was dedicated in 2012. I will allow each of the speakers to have 12 minutes, and I do have already 15. Haggling starts immediately. But you know what? He's right. It was 15 minutes. Okay, mea culpa. It's very Jewish. 15 minutes then. Okay, and I will try to ask a few general questions that arise from the presentations, and then we'll give the speakers another chance to respond, and then we'll take questions from the audience. In such a conference, I would want to say, to conclude my introductory in an optimistic way, that we can draw humanistic lessons from the study of the Holocaust and genocide in order to make sure that all human beings from the Jordan River to the sea will enjoy human rights and the right of self-determination. But actually, I'm not that certain about that. This opinion in and of itself refuses to acknowledge that we're past this ability of using such sublime concepts as humanistic rights, lessons, in order to describe the situation that evolved here. And still, I believe that we should discuss these topics. I understand the idea that lies in the foundation of boycotting this specific conference, but it seems wrong to me. You can boycott governments, but we're academics and intellectuals. What is left to say is to simply exchange opinions. That's what we do for a living, right? Especially when they are contradictory. It is true, it won't save the world, but it is at the very foundation of our profession, and it's preferable to so many other things that I can think of. Silence has power, and words have power too. Thank you very much.